Today we're going to jump right into an interesting discussion topic submitted through the Let's Talk Bitcoin subreddit that you can visit by going to letstalkbitcoin.com/talk. This one is entitled Bitcoin on American Indian Reservations. I was listening to a non-Bitcoin related podcast, says Thomas533, where they were talking about the possibility of avoiding U.S. federal regulations by partnering with American Indian tribes because they have tribal sovereignty. It occurred to me that this would also be a great place for Bitcoin too. A quick Google search didn't turn up any discussions on this, so has the idea been thought of already? The Bush II administration clarified that, quote, limitations on tribal powers of self-government are few and include the same limitations applicable to states. For example, neither tribes nor states have the power to make war, engage in foreign relations, or coin money. And this is important, the coin money part. This does not seem to imply that they must take US dollars as their default currency. In fact, the late Russell Means of the Republic of Lakota had proposed the nation not use fiat currency, but instead adopt a gold standard. Would they be interested in using Bitcoin? This is a really interesting use scenario, I think, because they're right. You know, in a lot of places, there are de facto monies. You know, in most parts of the world, the local currency is the de facto money. But because there are these nations within nations, they don't necessarily have those same rules applied to them. So what do you guys think about this as it relates to Bitcoin?
I think it's a really interesting idea. I'd like it if everybody were just, free to use Bitcoin completely freely. I can see why people feel like this appeals to them, though, trying to partner up with Native American tribes. And actually, historically, there was the Lakota Nation, and they had the Free Lakota Bank where they were minting silver and stuff like that. Probably didn't care too much about those rules that said, you can't make coins or whatever. And they also tried to secede like about 1 million times, and they did secede about 1 million times. It's just I don't know if the U.S. government recognized it. So there's been a huge movement for Native American sovereignty that's gone on for quite a while. And it's interesting. I was just on a road trip and I went through upstate New York, and there was the Six Nations, Oneida Six Nations, where there are several, Native tribes that have federally recognized sovereignty, and they've got some land that they have, and cops don't go in there. They kind of like turn around at the boundary. You don't have to show a passport or any documents to go in there, which is pretty cool. I like that. You can go in and sit down at a casino or in a restaurant, and it has smoking section and non-smoking section, which you wouldn't find in the US. And not that that's exactly like the freedom that I really want to have. I'm not a smoker or anything, but just made it obvious that you're not in Kansas anymore, right? You're in a different place. Yeah, I mean, like Bitcoins, sure, that could be a natural fit. The thing that I would really like to see more than that, though, is for people to not have to necessarily go into a Native American reservation or whatever to be able to use Bitcoins. I'd like to just see complete freedom of Bitcoin use everywhere.
I don't necessarily know if we're talking about needing to go into a reservation in order to use Bitcoin. I think this is more like if you had, say, an exchange that was based out of, one of these reservations, then they don't necessarily have the same sort of rules because it's technically not the United States. Now, whether or not, again, like you said, the United States chooses to recognize this is a different matter entirely. And as we've seen, companies like Kapochi Wallet have opted not to do business with any U.S. customers whatsoever, because even though they're not a U.S. company, the U.S. financial authorities assert that if you do business with any single U.S. customer, then de facto, all the same rules that apply to everyone who is a U.S. company also apply to you.
Exchanges and a vibrant Bitcoin economy on native reservations and stuff like that would do a lot. It's really interesting in the U.S. because there's these American Indian reservations. Some of them, they're doing pretty well. There's not much poverty. Some of them, there's like a lot of poverty, a lot of, unhealth, a lot of disease. It's frankly the places where the federal government has stepped in and done everything, wanted to manage everything about the lives of these people on top of taking their land originally. I think like having a Bitcoin economy there could really be a chance for economic revitalization, especially in some of these areas where they really need it.
Well, interestingly enough, over the history of the Indian reservations, even if the federal government doesn't particularly like it, the courts have actually recognized quite an extensive level of sovereignty in the reservations, including with regards to gaming, which has been established by the Supreme Court in several separate occasions, but also in issues of money lenders and money transmitters and other things like that. Far more than a currency, within the reservation, I think it would be much more interesting to think of the reservation as a sovereign legal environment for establishing exchanges, for establishing payment suppliers and things like that within the US.
Do you think that that would get around FinCEN asserting authority? Because, I mean, it seems like, you can treat it like a different country, but it's still...
Well, keep in mind, it's not just FinCEN, right? So you've got all these overlapping jurisdictions, and I don't think FinCEN has been the main problem, or the federal government necessarily. The states have been. Whether you get out of the federal government jurisdictions, yes, you do partly, but not entirely. So there are some things, there's a lot of overlap. But Indian reservations are subject to some state regulations, not all state regulations in the states they reside. So again, it's a patchwork of laws, and certainly they have some sovereignty more so than the county next door that's not an Indian reservation. I think it's worth a court case, and that's really the only way you find out. Start one, let them sue, don't let them shut you down.
I'm kind of excited about that idea. I wonder if it's already been started. I wonder if somebody's already kind of doing this.
Well, if casinos were a good idea for American Indians and were able to generate revenues for the reservations, I think Bitcoin exchanges could effectively do the same thing, but with a much more global audience and with much less reliance on geographic borders. This should be great. It's another way to take advantage of what little American Indians got back from the U.S. government.
That's a really interesting point, that it's about the global audience relative to gambling, where it's more about people coming in. Because I talked about this with Jeffrey Tucker the last time we spoke, about this idea that a country like, say, Greece or Cyprus could choose to effectively opt out of the monetary system and use Bitcoin to, instead of being in their local or their regional, with the euro, they could instead be in the global system, which is, of course, the Bitcoin or the cryptocurrency system. So, I mean, it seems like the same thing could very much apply here with these little sovereign nations, and each one of them not only can connect to each other through this as a means of doing easy business, from reservation to reservation, but also to interact with the entire world, basically, which is very exciting.
Which is, in fact, how money used to work. I mean, the idea that you have a single source of money is ridiculous. And in fact, over the history of money, all of these sovereign environments, and in fact, much smaller units of organization down to city-states and even individual families, were issuing currency and backing that currency in a healthy market of currencies. Now it's down to sovereign states, and even those kind of not really. So I think it's a much more healthy return to how money should work in a much more free economy.
We don't have any direct experience with this, but if any of our listeners out there are part of a reservation or have an opinion on this that comes from a different perspective, absolutely write in, Adam at letstalkbitcoin.com, or go to the Let's Talk Bitcoin subreddit at letstalkbitcoin.com/talk.
I just wonder if there's a Native American reservation that has like a Bitcoin exchange or some kind of Bitcoin gaming operation there or whatever, and they start to do really well with it, is the federal government going to see that and think, oh, we need to get our hands on that? Or like the state governments, just like the lottery or even casinos, where they want like state-run casino in some places to generate revenue for the state. Like if it gets too successful, I'm wondering if governments are just going to be like, ooh, we want a piece of that in some way.
Nothing different about that. I mean, I think it's just commerce like any other, I mean, it's just
yeah,
the rules of the road.
Could you guys imagine like a state-run Bitcoin exchange? That would be like going to the DMV to go get some Bitcoins or something. I just have trouble imagining that.
Things used to be simple. Bitcoin wasn't taken seriously, so important companies like BitInstant were founded on a whim, the faintest scent of capital able to catalyze their startup operations for months. But things are different now, and as we move towards regulatory and governmental legitimacy, the barrier to entry for new people rises along with the cost of compliance. The Bitcoin Foundation is an organization on the razor's edge, pushing for legitimacy through education, yet trying to protect the nascent financial industry from the crushing burdens that come along with it. After meeting with an alphabet soup of regulators and legislators in DC earlier this week, Bitcoin NYC founder and LTB New York correspondent Jonathan Mohan caught up with Marco Santori, chair of the Foundation's Regulatory Affairs Committee and one of the primaries pushing towards a more nuanced understanding of Bitcoin at the government level. We join them now.
So, Marco, thank you for sitting down and talking with us. I know that you're a lawyer, but what is your involvement with the Bitcoin Foundation?
Right, I'm a lawyer in private practice here in New York City. I represent early-stage technology companies, more and more in the digital currency industry. and Bitcoin in particular. As to the foundation, I'm the chairman of the Bitcoin Foundation's Regulatory Affairs Committee, which means my committee, we interface with state and federal regulators on the topic of digital currency regulation. We try to, at least now, our focus is on education and closing the knowledge gap and making sure that state regulators and federal regulators understand the Bitcoin industry, the businesses in it, the users in it, what it has been, what it is, and what it might be, since realistically, none of us really know for sure.
This Monday, you and about 4 other representatives from the Bitcoin Foundation took to Washington to speak with federal regulators about Bitcoin. How did that meeting even come about?
It was FinCEN's conference. It was FinCEN's meeting, they called it, and they invited the Bitcoin Foundation. They also invited all of the other agencies, regulators, and enforcement agencies that were there. They managed to get really a lot of the biggest stakeholders in Washington in the same room. So kudos and hats off to them for doing so.
There were a lot of scary 3-letter named organizations there. Who were the agencies that were represented at the conference, and how well were they represented?
There were a ton of agencies there. And yeah, like you said, it's something of an alphabet soup when you list them all off, but I can try to get most of them if I don't get all of them. Well, obviously FinCEN had hosted it, so FinCEN was there. IRS was there, FDIC, Federal Reserve, Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, FBI, DEA, Secret Service, and the Department of Homeland Security was there as well.
So there were quite a number of enforcement agencies. What was their take on it?
As you might guess, the regulators and the enforcers each had different takes on Bitcoin, and they viewed Bitcoin through their own lenses. The regulators, they were more interested in the policy positions of what the consequences are of regulating Bitcoin in a certain way, whereas the investigative folks were interested in the nitty-gritty creative methodologies to find bad actors, to accomplish interdiction, and just general investigative tricks and tips that they could use to do their investigative jobs. And one of the representatives from the foundation who was there with me, Brian Klein, is actually an ex-federal prosecutor and was able to explain how, say, using the blockchain, for example, makes investigation of a Bitcoin transaction possible, and makes it possible in ways that investigating a cash transaction really would never be possible.
So would you say that there was more excitement or fear in the room?
It depends on who was asking the questions. So just to sort of recap the structure of it, there was about an hour's worth of presentation from each of the representatives from the foundation. And then we did about an hour of answering questions. Some of the questions were hard questions. And sometimes we had to give hard answers about what about Bitcoin is simply not going to change. What about Bitcoin might be changed in the future based on the community's interest in doing so. So some of the investigators, like I said, were interested in hearing more about enforcement methodologies. And the regulators wanted to know more about why, for example, somebody might want 10,000 different Bitcoin addresses if it wasn't to launder money. The investigators wanted to know what they would be able to do to follow a transaction from point A to point B, to really follow the money. Because if you know how criminal financial investigations work, typically they know who they're trying to get, the investigators. What the challenge is discovering what happened with the money, who took the money to whom, at what time, and what amounts, and that sort of thing. So I have to say, it was more interest than anything. I didn't get a lot of fear from people. I think that it was really encouraging, actually, to hear them asking intelligent and informed questions and not just giving sort of knee-jerk reactions that I think a lot of people feared we were going to get.
The following day, you spent almost the entire day talking to congressmen about Bitcoin. What was that experience like? How many did you end up talking to, and what were their concerns and their fears?
That's a good question. When you run through it in one day and try to look back on it, all the conversations are distinct, and everybody asks different kinds of questions and has different kinds of concerns. So when we were meeting with representatives from conservative politicians' offices, conservative legislators' offices, we would have one set of concerns. And when we were meeting with more liberal legislators, we'd have another set of concerns. And we'd have to respond to each of them and truthfully just sort of explaining what about the Bitcoin protocol is good and what's potentially bad for them. We really had a frank conversation, and I was surprised really to see the difference in levels of understanding and levels of concern. Some offices really weren't all that interested in Bitcoin. To the other side of the spectrum, some of them were really concerned about what was going on. Some of them were very informed about Bitcoin, and some of them, there was a knowledge gap that we needed to close.
What was one of the toughest questions that one of the congressmen asked? Like, just sort of kind of understanding from a fly on the wall what that conversation looked like.
I think that they were all, they all seemed to be concerned about money laundering. One of the more interesting concerns that I think is probably apropos is consumer privacy concerns. And they wanted to know about use cases. They wanted to know about examples of how Bitcoin supposedly puts privacy back into the hands of consumers. And what are the consequences of that? What are the good ones and what are the bad ones?
There's this vibe in the community that the government just wants to learn about Bitcoin, not to get it regulated, but to kill it as quickly as possible. When you were there, what was the feeling that you got from them? Was it that they're genuinely working together to get it regulated? Or do you think that there is just so much of a lack of understanding of Bitcoin, or maybe just a misunderstanding of how it can be used and a fear that it might be used to illicit means, that they may just want to kill Bitcoin entirely?
First of all, I don't think that anybody that we spoke with had any intention or desire to kill Bitcoin or to eliminate it, that at least they expressed to us. One of the positions that the foundation was very firm on, it was sort of where we had our pivot foot down. Really, our first moving proposition is that people have figured out how to use the internet to send money, and there's no changing that. There's no stopping it. The question is, how do we address it? What do we do from here? And that was our first premise. It's not something that anybody really seemed to question. I think that people understood intuitively that this is a real substantial development in the course of human affairs. I don't think anybody expressed any real interest in killing it or stifling it. What they wanted to know was, now what do we do?
I know you lead the Regulatory Affairs Committee. To a person listening to this talk who wants to get involved and help this community move forward as it relates to regulation, how could they contact you? How could they help?
Well, everybody that we've spoken to so far in Washington with follow-up comments and within the foundation, I think the general consensus is that this was just a tremendous, tremendous success for all involved. For those who want to get more involved, the first step is to look into joining the foundation. If you're interested in having a voice in the course of Bitcoin affairs generally, and specifically in these sorts of meetings, the best way to do that is to be a part of it.
Thank you so much for joining us, Marco. Keep up what you're doing.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
More than 300,000 users and counting trust blockchain.info. It's a Bitcoin wallet service and a wealth of Bitcoin information, and is completely free to use. With a blockchain.info wallet, you'll get the convenience of a web wallet and the security of a desktop client. Blockchain.info is also a block explorer. You can use it to see Bitcoin transactions in real time, check the balance of any Bitcoin address, and view many handy Bitcoin charts, all for free. See what they have to offer today at blockchain.info.